The Lore Bard is the best archetype in 5e. Okay, maybe not the best archetype, but it is very, very good, and this week I will be giving you an in-depth guide on how to make your Lore Bard one of the most pivotal members in any adventuring party. Hello players and GMs, I am Rhys, and welcome to another video by Jetpack7. Before we get started today, I just want to remind you all to please like, comment, subscribe, and to hit the notification bell. We are getting pretty close to 4,000 subscribers, which means we're kind of close to 5,000, which is pretty surreal the more that I think about it. So it really, really means a lot that you all are continuing to subscribe and continuing to watch my videos. So thank you all so much for your support so far. This week, I am starting another new series. Woo! This is going to be an archetype guide series, where I go through some of my favorite archetypes in 5th edition, maybe eventually all of them, but obviously there's a lot of them, so I may not get to the very end, but I will go through some of my favorite archetypes and tell you exactly how I like to play them and what kind of stuff that I think would be helpful to look out for when you're going through them. I know there's a good number of archetypes in this game that are generally considered kind of weak in the eyes of the majority of the community, but those are the archetypes that I like to play and try and make very powerful. Now, this week in particular, I don't think is a bard that people would consider weak at all, but I do know that a lot of people don't regard it as powerful as I do, and it is one of my absolute favorites, the Lore Bard. So I could talk about the Lore Bard all day, but basically all I'm going to say is that I feel like the Bard in general is one of the most flexible classes in the game, probably just below Cleric in terms of archetype variety and strength of those archetypes. And the Lore Bard is kind of the flexible spellcaster option. You can go into healing, you can go into utility, you can go into damage, you can build the Lore Bard in a lot of different ways, but I definitely have a preferred method, and in this video I will be telling you exactly what that preferred method is. So let's go ahead and jump right into it with the very simple beginner information of what are your proficiencies. So to start off, you obviously have a D8 hit die, you're proficient in light armor, simple weapons, and some other weapons as well. And you are proficient in dexterity and charisma saving throws, which are obviously some of the better saving throws in the game, particularly dexterity. You also gain proficiency in 3 skills. This is where your own personal choice begins to come in. For me personally, my ranking is persuasion or deception, whichever kind of avenue you want to go into, and then perception, investigation, and acrobatics in that order. These are some of the more commonly used skills in the game, and to be able to get particularly good at them, like a Lore Bard and really any other bard can, is a very potent ability. And as soon as you actually put a level into Lore Bard, you'll be able to get 3 more. So you don't necessarily have to choose between any of these, but there are other ones that would be helpful as well. But generally speaking, these are my top 4 or 5. Moving forward, Bard in general isn't a particularly equipment forward class, so really you're just looking for better light armor and better weapons that are dex based, in my opinion. And now we get into ability score priority. So a lot of people are of the opinion that it is charisma and then dex and then con. I am actually of the mind that it is charisma, con, and then dex. Largely because attacking with a weapon, as a Lore Bard in particular, it can only deal a little bit more damage than Vicious Mockery, and Vicious Mockery also applies the effect of giving them disadvantage on their next attack. So it kind of serves this utility purpose more so than a damage purpose, which to me is more along the lines of what I want from a bard, in particular a Lore Bard. Which also gives you the option to make Constitution your second highest stat, which has a couple very obvious and powerful benefits. The most obvious being extra health, the slightly less obvious being additions to your Constitution saving throw, which is obviously the same thing as your concentration checks. And we'll get into why that's even better for Lore Bards later on. And before we get into any actual Lore Bard specific content, we still have a couple things that you get from the base class that we can get into. So first of all is Bardic Inspiration. Bardic Inspiration is one of the unique mechanics that bards get that no other class can really get without taking one of the newer feats. I think maybe there's a feat that allows you to do that. But my recommendation for Bardic Inspiration is to use them early and to use them often. in combat, because at level 5 they're going to come back at a short rest, so it's not like you're particularly limited in your usage of them. Not to mention, when you're in combat, people don't remember that they have inspiration until you're shouting in their ear that they are inspired, and then they remember it at the last moment, and it usually ends up being a pretty clutch moment. But the fact that an inspiration lasts for 10 minutes and there's no concentration or anything like that, it makes it pretty risk-free to just throw them out early on in the fight and just start using your bonus actions. Now we can get into spell selection. So spell selection for bards is pretty complicated. This is one of the more complicated aspects of the class because bard is, like I said, one of the most flexible classes in the game. So you can go to a lot of different directions with the spells that you want. But for me personally, I like a heavy focus on utility and then the occasional healing spell here or there. But if you absolutely don't need healing because you've got like a focused healer in the group, then you can lean either fully into utility or you can dip into damage a little bit as well. I just think it's a little bit more effective to just focus on the utility because generally speaking in 5th edition, damage is not something that you're going to be lacking in a party just by the nature of the system. If you've got any other spellcasters in the group, they'll probably have Fireball or Eldritch Blast or something along those lines to be able to continuously dish out that long-range spell-casting damage that is available to most of the classes. So starting off with cantrips, to me, the most necessary cantrips right away are Vicious Mockery, Message, or Light if you don't have Dark Vision. I think Message, if you watched my cantrip ranking video, you saw how highly I rate Message. I think it is one of the strongest cantrips in the game by far, just allowing you to communicate at a moment's notice whenever needed and through telepathy essentially so that no one else can hear you. And then at 4th level when you do end up learning another cantrip, I think Mage Hand is another reasonable pick, or whichever one of those first 3 that you didn't get to choose because you needed Light. I think Vicious Mockery is kind of a necessity, especially in the build that I like to do, just because I'm not really going to be using my weapon attacks very much at all. And then for those 1st level spells, if you need healing, the obvious picks are Healing Word and Cure Wounds. If you want to enhance your party and increase their abilities, there's Fairy Fire, Long Strider, and Heroism. If you want to control your enemies and kind of put them down, then you can use Bane or Sleep. But the 2 spells that I almost always take on a bard, the kind of staples of my lore bard build, are Disguise Self and Charm Person. That said, those spells don't come quite in handy as much if you're playing in a more adventure, combat-heavy campaign. Disguise Self and Charm Person aren't going to help you as much if you're constantly fighting monsters or beasts or whatever. They aren't going to come in handy in those kind of situations. So if you are in a campaign that's more combat focused, then I would obviously lean more into a couple other damage spells or just take more of these healing and utility spells that I mentioned earlier. And like I mentioned before, the moment you get into Lore Bard, you get 3 additional skill proficiencies. So my honorable mentions for those are Survival and Arcana. I think those are 2 very, very commonly used skills that can come in handy to have someone in your party who's familiar with those. Obviously, Survival is often used to track creatures, and then Arcana is used to recall any information regarding magic and all that goofy stuff. So having someone in your party who can recognize those things is obviously very, very handy. And with 6 skill proficiencies at level 3, not including the background that you took, it's not like you're hard pressed for skill proficiencies. You can start to kind of spread your net very wide and become very, very good at everything. Not to mention, at this point, you've also got Jack of all trades. So all of your skills, whether you're proficient in them or not, are at least okay. So yeah, for these additional proficiencies, I would be willing to start moving into things like Survival and Arcana. That's what I would recommend. At the same level, however, just for the base bard class, you gain expertise in 2 of the skills with which you are proficient. So my obvious choices for that are Persuasion or Deception, again, whichever one you feel like you're going to use the most, and then either Perception or Investigation using that very same logic. My personal preference is Perception because that's the one that I've found being used the most. It will also raise your passive perception to really ridiculous levels, especially if you take the Observant feat. Things can get really, really ridiculous with a bard, so you can just continue stacking it on itself. That said, if you find yourself climbing through dungeons a lot and you need to look out for traps, then investigation might be the way to go if you need that more. And then we get to cutting words, and this is one that in my Bard archetype ranking video I actually misinterpreted. I thought that you could use it to detract from saving throws, but you can't. That would be really, really strong if you could, but unfortunately that is not the case. So to me, the strongest use of this is actually just to detract from attack rolls. It's still not as good as like the spell's shield, but obviously since you can use it on other creatures, that is a slight benefit to it, since it can aid your allies and not just yourself, but it's only for that one attack, so it's not going to like change the course of combat, but it can potentially keep someone up for another round. That said, I don't really see this being used quite as much as just regular inspiration. And now we get to the bread and butter of the lore bard. The thing that really sets this archetype apart from the rest of the bard archetypes is the first set of magical secret spells that you gain access to. Now, obviously every bard gets magical secrets at level 10, but the biggest thing for the lore bard is that you also get it at level 6, which means that right after you get 3rd level spells, the next level you can choose from any spell book in the game and take an additional 2 spells from those books. They don't have to be from the same class either, so you can pick 1 wizard spell, 1 cleric spell, 2 cleric spells, a paladin spell, and a cleric spell. You can dip into any other class of spellbook and make those spells bard spells. And they don't count towards the number of spells you have prepared, so it's just 2 free spells that you can add into your book from anywhere in the game, which is obviously an extremely potent ability. And for me personally, the 2 best spells that you can take from magical secrets at this level are Counterspell and Aura of Vitality. Counterspell to me is an absolute necessity in this case, because bards are better at counterspell than any other class in the game because of Jack of all trades. Like I mentioned earlier, Jack of all trades adds half your proficiency bonus to any skill check you make that you are not proficient with. That means you get the Jack of all trades bonus to initiative. You get it to literally any ability check you make that does not have an associated skill with it, which means that spell casting ability modifier checks are affected by Jack of all trades. Plus, Counterspell is just an incredibly powerful spell, so having that in your spellbook is an absolute must in my mind. Aura of Vitality, on the other hand, is just simply one of the best healing spells in the game. It allows you to use a bonus action every single turn to heal any creature within 30 feet for 2d6. It's basically just a less potent healing word, except you can do it every single turn at half the range. So it can continue just popping allies up over and over and over again every single turn, which is a very handy skill to have. That said, again, if you don't need healing at all because you've got a dedicated healer, then your options are very, very open. There are some obvious choices you can make for damage like Fireball. You can also take Spiritual Weapon, which is one of my favorite spells in the game. You can take Revivify to bring your party back from the dead, or you can take another one of my favorite spells, Rope Trick, and just continue trolling combat and giving your party a place to short rest while you are in the middle of a dangerous dungeon. Like I said, your options are wide open if you don't feel the need to take Aura of Vitality. Just a real quick thing to mention about Aura of Vitality that I forgot to say before is that it's also one of the best out of combat healing spells because it lasts for 1 minute and you can use a 2d6 heal every single turn. So if you just use it outside of combat, you can effectively heal for 20d6 over the course of a minute. So you can just kind of like bump your party back up to full HP without even having to take a long rest or a short rest. So yeah, little known fact about Aura Vitality, it's a very powerful spell, but it's Paladin only. So Lorebard is the only archetype you can use to actually get that spell. So we finished the first magical secrets. But then the wonderful thing about Bard is that you get it again at 10th level. So obviously at this point there are way more options because you have access to 4th and 5th level spells. To me, there aren't really any spells that you absolutely have to take. There aren't necessary spells at this level like Counterspell previously, but I would recommend keeping an eye out for Paladin spells because the fact that a Paladin is a half caster, gaining access to 5th level spells is way late game for them. But as a Bard, you can do it at 10th level. So Paladin spells are a little bit tuned with that in mind, the fact that they won't be getting them until way, way later into the game. So one of the Paladin spells that is really great in this situation is Circle of Power, especially if you're facing a lot of spellcasters. Another super potent utility spell is Wall of Force. Force. It's just really great for splitting up a fight, protecting your party, isolating an enemy. You can do pretty much anything you need with Wall of Force, so that is one of the spells that I would definitely recommend taking. If you feel like you need some extra mobility, you're also welcome to take Far Step, which is a really great spell for just constantly teleporting around the map and making yourself impossible to catch. So yeah, there aren't really any super necessary spells to take at this second Magical Secrets. That said, the options are endless. You can go through the entire spell list and pick whatever spells you need. You're welcome to go back and look at third level spells that you weren't able to get before and fill out your lower level spell slots with those. But if you want maximum efficiency from this, I would stick to fourth and fifth level spells. That said, it doesn't really matter that much. You're not going to make a bad decision here. Gaining access to a spell that the class normally doesn't have access to is always going to be very powerful. And then the final thing you get for Lore Bards is Peerless Skill, which essentially just allows you to inspire yourself, but only for checks. It's pretty straightforward, but honestly, as simply as I can put it, it's just not as good as normal inspiration because of the fact that you can only inspire yourself for skill checks. If you can inspire yourself for saving throws or attack rolls or whatever, then it might actually be more useful. But the fact that it's only skill checks makes me definitely prefer to just give inspiration to my allies. So this is just kind of like a last-ditch effort thing. If you really need to succeed on a skill check, maybe it's a concentration check or, I don't know, a very important persuasion check or stealth check or something like that, then it might really come in handy. But most of the time, I don't really see myself prioritizing this over just inspiring my allies as normal. Okay, so that is the end of the archetype. So now let's talk about moving forward, the things that you want to look for with a bard in general. So starting off, obviously the most important thing is spell selection. And for me, I think it is way more efficient to just continue piling up utility spells that will buff your party, that will hurt the enemies, that will provide you some sort of special effect that you can't get just from damage. My rule of thumb when crafting a spell list is generally to keep it between 1 and 2 concentration spells per level. Any more than that and you start to get kind of choked with concentration, you can't use more than 1 spell at a time. It starts to become too much and you lose a lot of efficiency that way. So you want to make sure you're choosing just the bare minimum number of concentration spells, the ones that you can definitely see yourself getting plenty of value out of. Other spells you want to look out for are survivability spells. Anything that helps you be more mobile, that helps you hide from enemies, or just not get hit from enemies will get a lot of use because bards don't get any extra movement speed. They don't get any boosts to mobility or survivability or anything like that. So you have to kind of add to that yourself through spellcasting, which makes spells like Dimension Door and anything that allows you to teleport around the map very, very helpful for bards. So I've got a few example spells here for each level past the first that I think are very useful. For second level, I put Aid, Invisibility, Suggestion, and Mirror Image. Obviously, all of these are utility spells. Some of them are helping your allies, some of them are hurting your enemies, and then Mirror Image obviously is keeping yourself safe. Invisibility can be used very much for that same purpose. I think these are all very useful spells in pretty much any situation, but again, they continue to focus on utility because I think that's just what the bard is best at. Third level, I put Hypnotic Pattern, Dispel Magic, Fear, Slow, and Leomund's Tiny Hut. Hypnotic Pattern is one of the most potent spells in the game, in my opinion. You can incapacitate an entire room full of people, and that is something that cannot be slept on, no pun intended. And then the other ones are pretty obvious. Fear is one that I feel like doesn't get used a lot, but it's actually really good for self-peel. So when you're getting crowded by enemies, you can cast Fear pretty much on your space, and many of those enemies will just fail and run away. And then obviously Dispel Magic is always helpful, Slow is always helpful, and Leomund's Tiny Hut is great for taking long rests. At fourth level, I have Dimension Door, Polymorph, Greater Invisibility, and Freedom of Movement. Like I said, mobility is huge, so Dimension Door and Freedom of Movement will get plenty of value, not to mention the fact that Dimension Door can allow you to teleport yourself and an ally, and Freedom of Movement can also be used on an ally instead of yourself. So they also kind of help buff the party as well. Polymorph is great because it's just one of the most flexible spells in the game. You can put an ally out of the fight, and you can turn your ally into a big heaping mass of hit points. You can turn yourself into that if you're about to die. And then greater invisibility is obviously very helpful as well, because you can, you know, make someone invisible no matter if they're casting spells or attacking or whatever, yourself included. So all of these also offer mobility and utility as well. 5th level, greater restoration, hold monster, teleportation circle, scrying, and raise dead. So obviously most of these are out of combat spells outside of hold monster. Greater restoration is definitely a handy skill to have if you don't have someone in your party who has access to it, because it can cure pretty much anything beyond like a really messed up high level disease or curse or whatever. Then I think the other ones are pretty obvious. Hold monster can help your allies kill something, teleportation circle, scrying, raise dead. That's all pretty straightforward, but all of those are also very useful to have. 6th level, I put Hero's Feast, Mass Suggestion, and Find the Path. Hero's Feast is one that the effects are definitely more passive. After you eat it, you're immune to fear, you have advantage on wisdom saving throws, you get temp HP. Overall, it's just a really nice spell to have, because especially if you're fighting something like an ancient dragon, then having immunity to fear can be a huge game changer, because their frightening presence can be absolutely crippling. If you fought against a dragon that uses its frightful presence every single round, it can be very difficult to take it down because you can't physically walk up to it and hit it. Mass Suggestion is pretty obvious. You can just end an entire room of people, tell them all to lay down. And then Find the Path is one that is very strong in the right campaign. If you know of a location, you can just say its name, and Find the Path just tells you how to get there. It says you have to be familiar with it, but I don't know if that means that you just have to know its name or you have to have visited it. So depending on your interpretation of that wording, then Find the Path might not be as strong as I'm saying it is here. But from my point of view, it seems like it's kind of the spell that just tells you where something is when you need to find it, which seems pretty dang strong. 7th level, Force Cage, Teleport, and the Resurrection. Again, all just very obviously powerful spells. Force Cage can absolutely take a creature out of combat. If you're fighting like a medium-sized creature that has legendary resistances, Force Cage ignores that totally. It doesn't give them a saving throw. If you put it around them, they're simply in it, and there's nothing they can do to get out outside of trying to teleport out and succeeding on a charisma saving throw, which, again, you can counterspell. So as a bard, you can lock people out of combat entirely. You can lock bosses out of combat, and that's just something that you can do because you have focused entirely on utility and disruption. 8th level, Antipathy, Sympathy, Dominate Monster, and Feeble Mind. Dominate Monster is pretty obvious. Feeble Mind is pretty obvious. Just take another creature out of the fight again if they fail the saving throw. And then Antipathy, Sympathy. This is one that doesn't get enough love, but basically I think the sympathy part of it is the strongest, or antipathy if you are trying to keep creatures away from you. But you can also cast Sympathy to get monsters to group up around a very small object. So again, it offers a lot of options, and that's kind of a theme that I've been seeing with a lot of the spells I select, is that they're spells that aren't just used in a single way. That's the problem with a lot of damage spells that I've seen throughout 5th edition, is that it's straightforward. You're going to hit creatures with it, it's going to deal damage, and that's the end of it. But utility spells, a lot of them, can be used flexibly. You can buff yourself, you can buff your allies, you can hurt your enemies, you can take people out of the fight entirely, and these are all things that a single utility spell can do. So a bard in general is a class that's going to be able to do a lot of different things, and oftentimes it takes some thought on how to actually apply those things in an efficient way rather than just hitting something with a damage spell and hurting it. And then for 9th level, honestly, it doesn't really matter what you take here. All the 9th level spells are ridiculous, but some of the more powerful ones, in my opinion, are Power Word Heal, Mass Polymorph, Prismatic Wall, and Foresight. Foresight is obviously going to buff that ally to a really ridiculous level, giving them advantage on pretty much everything for 8 hours. Prismatic Wall can end/disrupt a fight, Mass Polymorph can end a fight, and Power Word Heal heals your party for really dumb amounts. So it's a very 9th level, do whatever you want, do whatever you need. If you don't need healing, obviously don't take Power Word Heal, but it does get to a point where you're at 9th level spells that it doesn't matter anymore. Just take whatever spell you want. So like I was saying, bards are really kind of jack of all trades. They can do everything with a very small amount of spell selection. They actually don't get a huge spell book. They don't add too many spells to their list very often. Obviously lore bard is kind of the exception because of the double magical secrets that you gain access to, but their actual spell book itself is much smaller than a lot of the other full spellcasting classes. But despite that, that if you build into utility and you don't try to be one of the other like damage dealers of your party, you can be extremely potent in those combats with the spells that you've selected, even though you don't have access to quite as many. Now let's get into combat strategy. For bards, it's pretty simple. You want to just kite for your life. You want to keep enemies away, and you want to keep your allies buffed up as much as possible. Like I said early on, you want to use your inspiration very early. It lasts 10 minutes, it doesn't require concentration or anything like that, so there is absolutely no reason not to just throw them out as much as possible and as early as possible if you find yourself in a combat where you think you'll need them. In addition, keep reminding your party that they are inspired. People will always forget, especially if you're in a bigger party or in a larger combat. The amount of time that goes in between rounds, people are going to forget that they're inspired. So either keep reminding them or add some sort of marker or token to their token that will allow them to remember that. It will come in handy and it will help them in moments when they need it. In addition, Lorebard has more uses for bonus actions than any other casting class in the game, rivaling that of like a monk or a rogue. You can use your bonus action pretty much every single turn if you took the spells that I suggested. Between Inspiration and Aura of Vitality or Spiritual Weapon, depending on which one you took, and then later on Freedom of Movement and Far Step, you will be able to use your bonus action nearly every single turn if you need to. And that is extremely powerful. Action economy is one of the big things in 5th edition that makes a class super powerful or significantly less powerful. That's kind of how they nerfed the wizard. The wizard pretty much only has action spells, but the fact that they have access to the entire spellbook essentially makes it pretty much okay. But yeah, with a Lorebard, just keep using your bonus actions. You've got the options, so go ahead and use them. Get full use out of all of your actions. Obviously, you want to hit big groups with your AoE, disable spells. Don't let spellcasters play the game. You have the best counterspell in 5th edition. You have access to dispel magic. You have spells like Force Cage that can lock them in a box and prevent them from using spells at all. You have more methods to disable other creatures than anyone else, so take full advantage of it and don't let spellcasters get off those big hits. Don't be stingy with spell slots used to keep you alive. Don't be afraid to blow those 4th level spell slots to use Dimension Door to get out of the way. Use your spell slots to keep yourself alive because utility only matters if you can stay alive to do it. And the fact that a lot of your more useful and more powerful spells require concentration requires that you keep yourself from becoming incapacitated to maintain them. Obviously, there are some duration spells that will go on throughout that, but most of the time, if you want to maintain a spell, you have to maintain concentration on it, so you need to keep yourself alive. And then lastly, this one sounds pretty obvious, but you have to know what your spells do. At a pretty intimate level, study your spells, figure out what they do, and ask your DM how they may interpret certain things, because there's obviously some flexibility within spells in 5th edition. Knowing how certain interactions work can change the course of a fight and has done it very regularly for me. If you get into the intricate details of a spell and how it may interact within a combat, that can be a huge difference maker for the outcome of a fight. And lastly, for out of combat stuff, you are the face of the party. You probably have the highest charisma, and if you don't have the highest charisma, you probably have the highest persuasion or deception because of your skill proficiencies and your expertise. Regardless of what your ability score is, your skill proficiencies are probably higher than anyone else in your parties, which brings me to the next point. You're a skill monkey. So lean into that. You are at least okay at everything. You are very good at several things, and you are extremely good at a few as well. So whenever possible, try and lead the checks, because whatever the skill is, you're probably the best at it. That said, you want to make sure that for the flow of the party and for the sake of letting everyone have their moment, you don't want to dominate every single roleplay opportunity. But when you can find a chance, try and assist with whatever roles are happening. If you can, try and slide in and lead the check if possible, or alternatively, give them some sort of assistance in the check itself through inspiration or a disguise or invisibility, whatever you can to help them with their checks, because you probably have something that will make it better and easier for them. In conclusion, as the Bard, you are simply the jack of all trades for your party. You can do pretty much anything the party needs you to do outside of leading in damage. You may not be the best healer, you may not be the best damage dealer, but if you allow yourself to lean further into the utility aspect of things, you can be one of the most potent members of the party by far. Look no further than Scanlan at the end of Critical Role's first campaign, just constantly spamming out these counterspells to continue thwarting Vecna's efforts, the Archlich, the nearly godhood Archlich, from doing anything. He stopped him from casting so many spells and made such a huge impact on the fight, even though he didn't lead damage or, heal his party up with mass heal or anything like that. And as a lore bard, you can do that in pretty much every single combat you will find yourself in, which to me makes it one of the most fun and most useful and interactive archetypes in the game, despite what other people might think. Alright, that is my archetype guide for the Lore Bard. Let me know in the comments what you think of this one and what other archetypes you'd like to see me do a guide for. If you liked this video, please consider liking it and subscribing to the channel. And of course, as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you around.